Miss Marsh, I'm going to be direct because I don't see any kindness in dragging this out.
I'd like to see the access trail.
That documentation is with legal. It's not available to you. She was fired immediately.
Be careful not to lose the evidence, Marsh.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to lose your job again.
Good riddance.
Just leave me alone. Hey, I don't have long. Tom's counsel filed an emergency motion this morning. They're using your termination as evidence. Unstable income, can't maintain steady employment. They want an emergency custody review. Yoan, I need 3 things, and I need them fast.
Okay, go.
Every record the 9th floor has touched in the last 4 years under legal hold, before end of business today.
Mrs. Marsh, I'm going to be direct with you, because I don't see any kindness in dragging this out. Carol Ness's voice didn't shake. Her hands did, just slightly, around a folder she'd been told not to let Erin see inside. A significant volume of restricted data was extracted from the audit system you built. It traces back to your login. Effective immediately, the company can't continue your employment. I'd like to see the access trail. Paige Kessler stood by the window with her arms crossed and didn't so much as glance over. That documentation is with legal. It's not available to you. Is there a process to contest this? The termination is immediate and final. Erin looked at the woman across the table, 45 years old, arms folded, watching all of it unfold with the mild, satisfied patience of someone who had been waiting 5 weeks for exactly this moment, and understood something Paige Kessler didn't know yet, wouldn't know for a few hours more, and would spend the rest of her career wishing somebody had told her sooner. She had just fired the wrong person. By early afternoon, everything Erin owned in that building fit inside a single cardboard box. A coffee mug with a chip in the handle, a phone charger wound too tight around itself, a single folder, and inside the folder, folded twice so it wouldn't show through the cardboard, a crayon drawing of a woman standing next to a very tall building. She walked out through the revolving doors of Halsted Logistics Group's downtown tower. A few minutes past 3 in the afternoon, and nobody behind her tried to stop her, because nobody behind her thought there was anything left worth stopping. Kessler was waiting by the glass wall near the elevator bank when Erin came through, arms crossed, wearing the same satisfied patience she'd worn in the conference room, like a woman checking a job off a list. Behind her, through the glass, the lobby carried on the way lobbies do, oblivious. A security guard checking his phone, a courier signing someone in, none of them with any idea that the ordinary-looking woman walking out with a cardboard box was about to be the reason half of them had a very different Tuesday than the one they were expecting. Erin did not look back at her. She stepped out onto the top of the entrance stairs. The afternoon light was flat and grey, the kind Denver gets in early spring when the sky can't decide what season it wants to be. She set the box down on the concrete railing. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She scrolled to a contact saved under 2 letters. She pressed call. The line picked up on the second ring. Her voice when she spoke was even, unhurried. A person standing 10 feet away would not have been able to tell that 4 hours earlier she had been sitting in a glass-walled office signing a piece of paper that ended her job for something she had not done. She said 3 things. The first was an instruction to put every record the 9th floor had touched in the last 4 years under legal hold before the close of business. The second was a request to have the board in a conference room within the hour, whether or not all of them wanted to be there. The third was the sentence that would move through that building like weather before the day was finished. Every one of them, she said. Every single one. She ended the call. She picked the box back up. She did not go back through the revolving doors. She walked toward the parking structure instead, past a bank of windows that reflected a tired-looking woman in flat shoes who did not, from the outside, look like someone who had just changed the direction of a company worth more money than she let herself think about most days. 4 hours earlier, none of this had a name yet. 4 hours earlier, Erin Marsh had just been a temporary logistics associate on the 9th floor. 5 weeks into an assignment nobody thought was worth remembering her name. 4. Sitting at a borrowed desk with the stack of carrier invoices that did not add up, wondering, the way she had wondered every single day since she'd walked into that building, how long she could keep being nobody before somebody saw us noticed. She had wanted to be nobody for exactly one reason. It was the only way to see what a company actually was. instead of what everyone assumed it was, because of whose name happened to be on the building. She had not expected to find what she found. She had not expected any of it to reach into the other fight she was already having, quietly, on a completely separate front, in a family court file, with her daughter's name typed in the header, but it had. And by the time the box was in her arms, both fights had become the same fight. This is the story of the 5 weeks that made that true. 6 months earlier, her father had called her on a Tuesday and said 4 words that reorganized the rest of her year. I had a scare. Not the words a cardiologist would have used. Walter Halsted did not talk like a man with 3 stents and a folder of discharge paperwork. He talked like a man who had built a logistics company out of 2 trucks and a fax machine in 1987, and who intended to keep talking that way until somebody made him stop. Erin had been in Tulsa at the time, 6 weeks into a distribution center turnaround contract. Josie asleep in the next room of a corporate apartment that still smelled like new carpet. She had been doing this kind of work for 4 years, Reno then Tulsa, one unglamorous fix after another, the kind of job where you learn a company by finding out exactly where it's been lying to itself. She was good at it. She had gotten good at it during the same stretch of years she'd spent watching her marriage end in slow motion, which was either a coincidence or it wasn't. And she'd decided a long time ago not to look at that too closely. She flew home the next weekend. Her father was sitting up in a hospital bed looking, as always, like a man mildly inconvenienced by his own body. I need to know who runs this after me, he said. No preamble. He never did preamble. Not who's smart enough, who's earned it. You have a whole executive floor of people who tell you they've earned it. I have a whole executive floor of people, he said, who have never had to explain to a shift lead in Pueblo why his overtime got cut. You want the seat, you start on a floor. Any floor. Nobody knows your face. Nobody knows your name. You learn what this company actually is before you learn what people say it is. It was the same condition he'd been repeating since she was 19, the summer he'd sent her to work a receiving dock, instead of letting her go to Europe with her friends. She had hated him for it then. She understood it now. The way you come to understand things you've spent your whole life circling without landing on. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. She had one condition of her own, and it had nothing to do with the company. I use Marsh, she said, not Halsted. Nobody connects a temp on some floor to you. Not yet. Not until I say. Her father looked at her for a long moment, the particular look he gave things he approved of but wasn't going to say so out loud. Marsh, he said. Fine. Your mess to manage. She hadn't told him the other reason she wanted her married name kept quiet, the one that had nothing to do with corporate optics, and everything to do with a custody mediator 2 floors above a Starbucks. Tom's attorney had already used the phrase unstable income once, in a filing, in writing, where it would sit forever. She did not need Halsted Logistics Group's name attached to hers in a family court file, not with the hearing coming, not with everything else still unsettled. Better to be Erin Marsh, temp, 5 weeks into an assignment nobody would remember. Better to be nobody on paper in every direction at once. She had not expected both directions to collide. The 9th floor of Halsted Logistics Group's downtown tower housed regional operations and carrier compliance, the desks that reconciled freight invoices, chased missing bills of lading, and made sure the trucks the company paid for were trucks that actually existed. It was not a glamorous floor. Erin had asked for it specifically, the same way she'd asked for Reno and Tulsa specifically, because the ordinary floors were where you found out what a company actually was. Dana from HR handed her a badge, pointed her toward the elevator bank, and went back to her paperwork without a second question. Nobody looked twice. That was the entire point of showing up in plain trousers and a blazer that had seen 4 years of turnaround contracts. Her supervisor was a woman named Paige Kessler, mid-40s, efficient in the specific way people become once they've learned exactly how little effort a job requires when other people are doing it for you. Kessler looked Erin over once, the way you'd size up a new appliance, and said without much interest that she'd be handling data reconciliation for the quarterly carrier compliance report. She dropped a stack of files on the desk, 3 days overdue already, and walked away before Erin could ask a single question. Erin sat down. She opened the first file. The formatting was inconsistent. Half the source tags were missing. Entries were duplicated across 3 spreadsheets that didn't talk to each other. It wasn't hard. It was just tedious, the kind of mess that piles up when nobody senior has looked closely at a process in years. She threw it in near silence while the floor moved around her. She noticed the way you notice weather, the shape of the room. Kessler sat at the center of it. Grant Weller and Sylvie Doyle sat closest to her, angled toward her desk the way plants angle toward a window. Everyone else sat further out in a loose ring, the floor's social gravity pulling inward and staying there. Grant was loud. He had a talent for saying things that sounded like jokes right up, until you thought about them a second too long. Sylvie was the opposite. Quiet, precise, the kind of person who read a room before she said a word in it, and who said only exactly enough to stay aligned with whoever currently held the floor's favor. By the end of her first day, Erin had cleared the entire backlog. She didn't announce it. She saved the finished files to the shared drive formatted clean and went to refill her water bottle. 2 days later, she heard Grant on a call with the compliance director, taking credit for the exact reconciliation work she'd done, without a flicker of hesitation in his voice. Kessler, standing nearby, nodded along and CC'd Grant on the follow-up email to leadership. Erin's name did not appear anywhere in the thread. She read the email standing at her own desk. She closed the laptop. She said nothing. Grant caught her at the coffee machine 2 days, eater easy smile. No idea she'd read the whole thread. "You're fast," he said, like it was a personality flaw he found charming. "Careful, though. People who work too fast around here make everybody else look bad. Not saying it's a problem, just saying, pace yourself, sweetheart." Erin poured her coffee and said nothing back, because there wasn't a version of that sentence worth spending words on. She wasn't surprised she was paying attention. Her phone buzzed in her bag around 4 that afternoon. She didn't check it until she was alone in the elevator, headed down. A text forwarded from her attorney's office, 3 lines long. The words custody evaluation and preliminary date sat in the middle of it, like a stone dropped into a pond she hadn't finished crossing. She put the phone away before the doors opened. She had learned over the last year how to carry 2 entirely different kinds of weight at the same time, without either one showing on her face. She was starting to suspect, the only skill this month was actually going to test. The pattern on the 9th floor didn't take long to show itself. Any piece of good work Erin produced got claimed by someone else. Usually Grant, sometimes Sylvie, occasionally Kessler herself. Any mistake, even one that had nothing to do with her, found its way back to her desk before it ever reached Kessler's inbox. The floor had a system for this. Errors needed a name attached before they went upstairs, and the name attached was always the person with the least standing to push back. Erin let herself be that person. For now. She watched the system run on someone else 3 weeks in, and it was worse to watch than to live through. Teresa Aldrich was a compliance analyst, 6 years at the company. Careful in the way people become, once they've learned that carelessness costs them more than it ever costs anyone above them. She made a small formatting error on a regulatory filing, the kind of thing that took 90 seconds to fix. Kessler called it out in the middle of the open floor, loud enough that the whole room heard the edge in her voice, loud enough that it clearly wasn't about the error at all. Teresa went very still. Her face didn't move. "Yes, I'll fix it," she said in a voice with no weather in it whatsoever. And she fixed it, and then she sat looking at her screen for a long moment after Kessler had walked away, not typing anything. Erin watched that stillness and recognized it instantly, the way you recognize a posture you've held yourself. It was the specific stillness of someone who had learned that any visible reaction would be used against her later. There was a quieter cruelty running underneath all of it too. Lunch plans finalized just loudly enough for Erin to hear that she wasn't included. Questions in meetings aimed to expose a gap rather than gather information. Files that landed at 4:50 in the afternoon due the next morning, always missing exactly the context that would have let her do the work cleanly the first time. Meeting invites that somehow never reached her inbox until they'd already started, forwarded 10 minutes late with an apology that wasn't one. None of it on its own was anything a person could file a complaint about. That was the design. Each piece looked small enough to explain away. Together they were a wall. Erin waited until Kessler's office door had swung shut before she got up to refill her water bottle and let the detour take her past Teresa's desk on the way back. "You okay?" she said, quiet, not stopping. Teresa looked up, surprised enough by the question that it took her a second to find an answer. "Yeah, thanks, a beat. Nobody usually asks that." "I know," Erin said and kept walking, because stopping any longer would have said more than either of them could afford that week. Erin had started running again in the mornings, before Josie woke up, before the sitter arrived. 40 minutes carved out of a schedule that otherwise belonged to everyone but her. She used the time to think without the noise of the floor around her. She had expected to find the ordinary friction of corporate life on the 9th floor: politics, inefficiency, a personality conflict or two. What she was finding instead had a shape to it, a structure, a set of rules everyone on that floor understood without anyone ever writing them down. People either participated or they went quiet, because quiet was the only kind of safety the floor allowed anyone. She thought about her father's condition, ground up, not top down. She understood now, in a way she hadn't at 19, exactly what he'd been trying to protect. He'd said to her, once, years ago, standing in the yard of the first warehouse he'd ever leased, "A company's real balance sheet is whether the people inside it trust each other. Everything else is just numbers pretending to be the whole truth." She had believed that as a principle. She was only now finding out what it looked like when it wasn't true. The reconciliation work kept surfacing something she couldn't name yet. A pattern in the carrier invoices. One name that showed up more than it should, attached to loads that moved through the system a little too cleanly and a little too tidy for an industry where paperwork was never tidy. She flagged 3 instances in her second week and moved on, because she had 200 more invoices in the stack, and no particular reason yet to think 3 coincidences were anything but 3 coincidences. Out of habit more than suspicion, she pulled the carrier's DOT number and checked it against the Federal Registry, the way she'd learned to in Tulsa whenever something felt too smooth. 2 of the entries came back clean. One came back registered to an address that on the satellite view was a self-storage facility off I-70. She looked at that for a full minute before she made herself close the tab and go back to the stack. Not yet. Not with 200 invoices left and a Friday deadline that didn't care what she'd just seen. She would think about that flag again later, in a very different room, and she would understand exactly how wrong she'd been to file it under coincidence. But that Friday afternoon, closing her laptop with the 9th floor emptying out around her, all she knew was that something in those numbers didn't sit right, and that whatever it was had been sitting there unnoticed for a great deal longer than 5 weeks. Monday morning, Kessler called Erin into the glass-walled office for the first time. Finance flagged some inconsistencies in carrier billing, Kessler said, not looking up from her screen. Nothing dramatic. Invoices that don't reconcile clean against the load board. "I need someone to build out a tracking system, pull the history, get it organized enough that somebody upstairs can look at it without falling asleep. You cleared the compliance backlog in a day, congratulations. You get to do it again, except this time it's 4 years of records instead of 4 days. How long do I have? However long it takes you to be thorough. Don't be slow about it." Erin nodded and did not smile, because smiling would have been the wrong currency to spend on Paige Kessler, and she had already started learning the floor's exchange rate. She built the tracking system over the next 4 days, a clean master log, cross-referenced by carrier, by load, by date, by dollar amount, the kind of structure that made a mess legible instead of just organized. She shared edit access with Kessler and Grant so the 2 of them could keep working the front half of the audit while she finished the back half. It was the obvious professional thing to do. Nobody builds a shared tracking system and hoards the keys to it. Sylvie helped for exactly 2 afternoons, precise, useful, entirely unmemorable, the kind of help that never quite left a fingerprint anywhere. Then she stopped showing up to the shared document, and Erin didn't think much of it at the time, because people on that floor came and went from projects the way weather comes and goes from a coastline. You learned not to ask why. She would understand much later exactly how that decision was used against her. In the meantime, she worked, and the work kept telling her something. She didn't want it to be telling her. She knew the shape of what she was looking at, before she had a name for it, because she'd seen a smaller version once in Tulsa, a carrier that existed only on paper, a name, a DOT number, nothing behind it, no trucks, no drivers, no yard. Someone with the right access reroutes a legitimate load through the shell, instead of the real carrier that was supposed to haul it, collects the payment meant for the real hauler, and the real carrier either never gets paid or never even learns the load existed in the first place. The industry had a name for it, double brokering. It had been getting worse for years, quietly, because the systems built to catch it were older than the fraud running circles around them. What she was looking at in the 9th floor's 4 years of invoices had that same shape, a carrier name, Northline Carriers, that surfaced again and again, always at moments that looked on paper entirely ordinary. Different scale than Tulsa, same shape. She didn't say anything yet. She didn't have enough yet. She kept building the log. The call with her attorney came on a Wednesday, during her lunch break, in her car in the parking structure, because it was the only place on the 9th floor's schedule where nobody could overhear her. They moved the hearing up, her attorney said. Tom's side wants it in front of the mediator before the school year decision has to get made. His filing leans hard on stability. Steady address, steady employer, steady schedule. You're going to want something on paper that says the same about you. I have a steady address. You have a temp assignment under a name that isn't the one on your divorce filing, Erin. I need you to understand how that reads to someone who doesn't know the context. It reads like you're hiding something. I am hiding something, just not the thing he thinks. A pause on the line. You want to tell me what that means? Not yet. Erin, I need 3 more weeks, maybe less. I'll explain everything the day I can, I promise you that. Right now I just need the hearing pushed as far as it'll push. Her attorney sighed. The particular sigh of someone who had learned not to argue with a client who used the word promise like it cost her something to say it. I'll ask. No guarantees. She hung up and sat in the car for a minute with her hands on the wheel, looking at nothing. Josie's school picture was clipped to the visor, gap-toothed, unbothered, 7 years old, and entirely unaware that 2 grown adults were arguing about which nights she'd sleep where. Erin looked at that picture, the way you look at the only fixed point in a room that's tilting. Then she went back upstairs and kept building the log, because the log, at least, was a problem she knew how to solve. That night, Josie wanted 3 books instead of 2, and Erin gave her 3, because there was no version of that week where she was going to say no to her daughter over 12 extra minutes of reading out loud. Josie fell asleep sideways, 1 foot hanging off the mattress. Erin sat on the floor of the room for a while after the light went off, the way she did most nights now, not because Josie needed her to, but because she needed herself to sit somewhere that wasn't a spreadsheet or a court filing or a floor full of people waiting for her to slip. She thought about the word her attorney kept using. Stability, as if it were a schedule printed on a page and not a person choosing, over and over, on not enough sleep, to keep showing up steady for the one person who needed her to be steady the most. Nobody on Tom's side had ever tried to define the word honestly. She wondered, sitting there in the dark, if anyone ever really did. By her 4th week, the pattern had a shape sharp enough to worry her. She started cross-referencing invoice dates against something she probably wasn't supposed to have access to, but did, because nobody had ever told her not to look. Informal personnel notes, time-stamped alongside performance reviews, and there it was, if you were looking for it, which almost nobody had been. The Northline Carriers spikes clustered again and again, around the same weeks that certain employees had received sudden negative reviews. Weeks when somebody had, according to a 2-line note in a file, raised concerns about team workflow. Weeks right before somebody quietly left the company, or quietly got moved to a different floor, or quietly stopped showing up in the org chart at all. This wasn't 4 weeks old. This was years old. Whatever it was, it had outlived multiple people who'd apparently gotten close enough to see it. She was still sitting with that thought on Thursday morning, when Reggie Coyne, a project coordinator 2 desks over, leaned back in his chair and asked, mildly, whether she'd had a chance to look at the Q2 vendor summary he'd sent her. Not yet, she said. I have actual work to do, Reggie. The words came out sharper than she meant them. sharp enough that Reggie's face did a small, surprised thing before he said, "Sure, sorry," and turned back to his screen. She felt it land the second it left her mouth. Reggie hadn't done anything except ask a normal question at a normal volume on a day that happened to be sitting on top of a custody hearing and a possible 4-year fraud pattern. And she'd taken it out on the one person on that floor who'd never once tried to claim her work or throw her under anything. "Reggie," she said quieter, "that was out of line. I'm sorry. Long week." He shrugged easy about it in a way that made her feel worse, not better. "We've all got 'em." She made a note to bring him coffee tomorrow and get back to work, because there wasn't time that morning to sit with the shame of it any longer than that. She kept the note. The next morning she left a cup on his desk before he'd sat down, no comment attached, and walked into her own desk like it hadn't happened. He never brought it up, neither did she. But after that, when Reggie had a real question, he asked it, and when he didn't, he let her work in peace. Which wasn't much in a room like that one, but it was more decency than most of the floor had to spare. The moment that scared her more came an hour later, in a status meeting when Kessler asked Teresa publicly pointedly to explain a discrepancy that Erin recognized immediately as Grant's error, not Teresa's. Erin felt the words rise in her throat, felt herself half a second from saying, "That's not her mistake. That's Grant's," in front of the whole floor, in exactly the tone that would have told Paige Kessler that this temp had been paying far closer attention than any temp should. She caught it. She swallowed it. She said nothing, and hated herself a little for the nothing, and told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for 5 weeks. Not yet. Teresa took the blame. Quietly, the way she always did. Erin went back to her desk and stared at the Northline Carriers line item until the letters stopped meaning anything. And underneath the anger there was a colder thought starting to form, one she didn't like at all. Someone on this floor had been watching people who got too close to this pattern for 4 years. And lately, someone on this floor had been watching her. She didn't know yet how right she was. What she didn't see, because it happened 3 desks away, while she was in the parking structure eating a sandwich alone, was Kessler stopping by the IT help desk and asking, in the same pleasant, unbothered voice she used for everything, whether someone could pull the access logs for the audit tracking system. "Just for review," she said. "Just to make sure everyone's staying inside their lane on something this sensitive." The IT tech pulled the logs and sent them along without a second thought. It was on its face an entirely reasonable request from a floor manager overseeing a sensitive audit. Erin never saw the email. She had no reason to. The confrontation happened on a Friday, in Kessler's glass-walled office, door closed, blinds still open enough that the rest of the floor could see 2 shapes talking without hearing a word of it. "Sit," Kessler said, and Erin sat. "You're good at this," Kessler said. Her voice had gone soft, almost warm, the specific warmth of someone handing you a compliment with a blade folded up inside it. "Better than good. I've had people on this floor for 6 years who can't build what you built in 4 days. Thank you. It's almost a shame," Kessler went on, still smiling, "that you won't be here long enough for anyone upstairs to notice. Temp assignments end, don't they? That's the nature of them. I suppose they do. Must be a lot, though, whatever's going on with you." Kessler tilted her head, mild as weather. "You get calls in the parking structure. You leave early some days, right on the dot, like someone's got somewhere to be. I don't ask, I don't need to know, I just notice things, Erin. It's the job." Erin kept her face very still, the way Teresa had taught her without meaning to. "I manage. I'm sure you do." Kessler leaned back, studying her the way you'd study a puzzle you were fairly sure you'd already solved. "You know what I appreciate about you, Erin? You don't perform. Half the people on this floor perform gratitude, perform loyalty, perform being fine. You just do the work and go home. It's efficient. I respect efficient." Is there a compliment coming, or is that the whole thing? Something flickered behind Kessler's eyes, not anger. Something closer to interest, the look of a woman recalibrating. There's the rest of it. She slid a folder across the desk. "I need the full Northline reconciliation complete by Monday morning. All 4 years. I know that's not much runway. I have faith in you. That's less than 72 hours for work that should take 2 weeks. Then I'd get started," Kessler said, and the smile didn't move at all, instead of arguing about it. Erin picked up the folder and left the office without another word. She did not look back through the glass. She didn't need to. She could feel Kessler watching her walk the length of the floor, cataloguing something, filing it away, the same careful way Erin had been filing away everything about Kessler for 5 weeks. That evening, packing up, her phone lit up with a message from her attorney, 3 lines. The mediator had a cancellation. The hearing had moved up again, 2 weeks out now, not 4. Erin stood at her desk with the phone in her hand and understood, all at once, that she had 2 clocks running now instead of 1, and neither of them had any intention of waiting for the other to finish. Monday morning started the way most of them did. Josie was at the kitchen table in mismatched socks, drawing with the specific fury of a 7-year-old who has strong opinions about the color of a building. "It's you," she said, holding it up, "at your work. It's really tall, so I had to use 2 papers. It's beautiful, baby." Erin taped the 2 sheets together at the seams, careful of the crease. "Can I bring it with me today? You have to fold it so it doesn't get wrecked." "I'll fold it twice." Josie considered this an acceptable level of care and went back to her cereal. Erin folded the drawing along its seam, twice, and slid it into the folder she carried everything important in, because there was no version of that morning where she was leaving that drawing behind. She dropped Josie at the sitters at 7:40. She was at her desk by 8:15, the Northline reconciliation open on her screen, 71 hours of a 72-hour deadline already spent. By 8:40 she'd found something new, a second shell entry, routed through a different DOT number but registered to the exact same storage unit address off I-70 she'd flagged 3 weeks earlier. 2 shells, 1 address. That wasn't coincidence anymore. That was a pattern with a signature on it. And for 1 full minute she let herself believe she was close to an answer instead of close to a trap. At 8:50, she noticed her badge hadn't scanned clean at the elevator. A half-second delay. A small stutter she wouldn't have registered on any other morning. At 9:10, a calendar invite appeared on her screen with no subject line and no sender name she recognized, just a room and a time. 10 o'clock, conference room 9C. She sat with that invite for a minute, feeling something in her stomach go quiet and cold, in a way that had nothing to do with logic yet and everything to do with instinct. At 9:55, Kessler's glass door opened and Erin saw, through it, 3 people already inside. Grant, sitting very still in the corner, the specific stillness of a person who already knows how a scene ends. Sylvie arranging a folder on the table with more care than the folder needed. And a woman Erin didn't recognize, mid-50s, a lanyard that read Carol Ness, HR. Carol stepped out and asked, with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering news she hadn't written herself, if Erin could come in. Erin closed her laptop. She picked up the folder with Josie's drawing in it, because some instinct told her not to leave it on the desk, and she carried it with her into the room. It went almost exactly the way some quiet, watchful part of her had already known it would go. "Mrs. Marsh," once the door was closed, "I'm going to be direct with you, because I don't see any kindness in dragging this out." A significant volume of restricted carrier and client billing data was extracted from the audit tracking system over the past 48 hours. The activity originated from your login credentials. There's a clear access trail. Given the sensitivity of what was taken, the company can't in good conscience continue your employment, effective immediately. Erin sat very still. "I'd like to see the access trail." Carol glanced once at Kessler. "That documentation is with legal pending review," Kessler said, arms crossed, voice even. "It's not available to you at this time. Is there a process to contest this?" "Given the nature of the incident," Carol said, "the termination is immediate and final." She slid a single page across the table. "Acknowledgement of receipt," it said at the top in a font that had clearly been used for this exact purpose more than once. Erin looked at the page for a long moment. "What happens to the audit itself?" she asked. "The Northline work. 4 years of records, most of it organized in the last 5 weeks. It stays with the company," Kessler said. Obviously, Erin repeated, and something in the way she said the word made Kessler's eyes narrow just slightly. The look of a woman noticing a draft from a window she was certain she'd already closed. Then she signed it. She asked for a copy. Carol provided one, hands not quite steady. Erin thanked her and meant it because none of this was Carol Nessa's fault, not really. And Erin had spent enough of her professional life reading rooms to know exactly whose fault it actually was. Sitting 3 feet away with her arms crossed and her expression arranged into something almost like sympathy. "Take care of yourself, Erin," Kessler said to her back, pitched to Carrie. "The kind of thing you say when you want a room to remember later that you said it." Erin didn't turn around. She walked back to her desk. The floor had gone quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone in it is watching without appearing to watch. Teresa didn't look up at all. Reggie did for half a second, and then looked immediately, deliberately, back down at his own screen. And Erin understood exactly why, and didn't blame him for it, not even a little. She put the chipped coffee mug in the box. She put the phone charger in the box, wound too tight around itself. She put the folder in the box, the one with Josie's drawing, still folded twice inside it. She carried the box to the elevator. She rode it down alone, watching the floor numbers count backward, and thought, with a strange and distant clarity, that this was probably the last ordinary elevator ride she'd ever take in that building, one way or another. She walked out through the revolving doors into flat grey afternoon light, and she did not know it yet, but this was the exact moment the story had already shown you once, from the outside, without any of what it cost to get there. She was 3 steps from her car, in the parking structure, when her phone rang. Her attorney's number. "Erin, I need you to hear this from me before you hear it from anyone else. Tom's counsel filed an emergency motion an hour ago. They're using a termination notice, today's date, as evidence of, and I'm quoting, ongoing professional instability relevant to the custody determination. I don't know how they got it this fast. I don't know how they got it at all. It's not public record yet." Erin stood with her hand on the car door and didn't say anything for a second. "Erin, I just got fired an hour ago," she said, "for something I didn't do, and somehow Tom's lawyer already has the paperwork." A long pause on the line. "That's not a coincidence you should sit with alone. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand exactly what you're telling me." She got in the car. She did not start the engine. She sat there for a full minute with both hands on the wheel, and what she felt underneath the shock wasn't panic. It was something colder and steadier than panic. The particular clarity that shows up right after the floor, finally, fully drops out and you realize you are still somehow standing. She scrolled to a contact saved under 2 letters OF and pressed call. Owen Faraday picked up on the second ring. He had been Halsted Logistics Group's general counsel for 11 years, had known Erin since she was in college, and had never once in all that time heard her voice sound quite like it did in that call. "Owen, I need 3 things and I need them fast. Go. I need every record the 9th floor has touched in the last 4 years placed under legal hold before end of business today. I need the board in a room within the hour, whether they like it or not. And I need you to hold my identity back from that floor until I say otherwise. Don't tell my father yet either. I'll call him myself in the next 10 minutes. Erin, what happened? I'll explain everything in the car. I'm already driving." She hung up. She started the engine, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, sitting at a red light 3 blocks from the building that belonged, one way or another, to her family, Erin Marsh did not know which fight she was more afraid of losing. The one with her name still on the door somewhere upstairs, or the one with her daughter's name on a court filing 2 miles away. Both clocks were running now. She had exactly 1 afternoon to stop them both. She called her father from the car, at a red light, in 4 sentences flat enough that he didn't interrupt a single one of them. Walter Halsted was standing when she walked into the 32nd floor boardroom, 20 minutes later, not seated, because Walter Halsted did not sit down when he was angry. He was dressed the way he always was, dark suit, no tie. White hair cut close, a posture that had never fully let go of the 2 years he'd spent in the army before any of this. The company, the building, the daughter walking toward him now carrying a cardboard box like evidence. Something in his face moved when he saw her, not quite relief. Something standing next to it. He didn't ask if she was all right. He'd never been a man who asked questions he could see the answer to. He just looked at the box in her hands for 1 long second and then looked away from it, like a man deciding, in real time, not to let himself be distracted by the thing that would upset him most. Owen Faraday was already there with 2 members of his legal team. 2 board members had dialed in and sat, slightly delayed, on a screen at the far end of the table, and Carol Ness, who had delivered Erin's termination notice an hour earlier with her hands not quite steady, had been asked to attend as well, and sat now at the far end with the specific composure of a woman who understood that her position in this room had changed since that morning, though she didn't yet know how much. Walter didn't open with anything soft. He confirmed the legal hold was already in place. He confirmed IT security had been pulled in to run a parallel audit of the access logs starting immediately. He confirmed that nobody on the 9th floor had been told anything had changed. The floor believed, as far as anyone knew, that it had simply won. "Walk us through it," he said to his daughter. "All of it." Erin stood at the table and did, without notes, 5 weeks. The credit theft, the pattern with Teresa, the deadlines built to fail. The Northline invoices, 4 years of them, clustering around the same weeks. Certain employees had quietly disappeared from the org chart. The audit assignment Kessler herself had handed her, the shared access that had let someone else move inside her own account. Carol Ness listened without expression, but her hand tightened, once, on the folder in front of her. She had been handed a single page that morning and told to deliver it without being allowed to look underneath it. That much, at least, was becoming clear to everyone in the room, including her. "I should have asked to see the trail myself," Carol said quietly, mostly to the folder in front of her rather than to anyone in particular. "I didn't. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that isn't on me too." Nobody in the room answered her. Erin noted, without saying so, that she'd been the only person that morning who'd said it out loud unprompted. Owen's team had already begun pulling the logs. It took them less than 30 minutes to find what they needed. The forensics weren't complicated. Once someone actually bothered to look, every login carried a device signature alongside the credential, browser version, screen resolution, a handful of small technical fingerprints. Nobody thinks to check unless they're already looking for a mismatch. Erin's signature, logged the same way every day for 5 weeks, looked nothing like the one attached to the extraction. The data flagged under Erin's credentials had in fact moved through her login, but the device it had moved through did not match any machine Erin had ever used. The IP address resolved to a workstation registered to Grant Weller. It wasn't sophisticated. It was the kind of thing that works precisely because nobody has ever looked closely enough to notice it before. "The framing is unambiguous," Owen said, setting the preliminary printout on the table. "We'll have the complete picture within a few hours, but this alone is enough to act on." Walter looked at his daughter. "How do you want to proceed?" "All hands," Erin said. "Today, call it for 4 o'clock and don't say why. I don't want a single person on that floor tipped off before I'm standing in the room to say it myself." One of the board members on the screen, a silver-haired man named Priest who'd sat on Walter's board for 2 decades, cleared his throat. "Walter, is now really the moment to be making a leadership announcement. We could contain the 9th floor matter quietly and revisit succession next quarter, once things have settled." "Things have settled," Walter said, is exactly the sentence that let this go on for 4 years. "No, we do it today." Erin nodded once, grateful, and didn't say anything else. Her father nodded once and turned to Carol Ness. "Company-wide notice, 4 o'clock main atrium. Mandatory. Say nothing beyond what's already been drafted." Carol wrote it down with a hand that had by now mostly stopped shaking. In the 2 hours between the notice going out and the doors opening, the building filled with the particular hum of speculation that happens when 400 people are told to gather and not told why. On the 9th floor, Paige Kessler held quiet court near the window bank, telling anyone who'd listened that transitions like this were usually good news for people who demonstrated real value to the organization. Grant laughed at something she said. Sylvie refreshed her email twice a minute. None of them connected the meeting to an emanation they'd engineered that morning. None of them noticed that Carol Ness hadn't come back to the floor. They had no way of knowing that the 9th floor's entire 4-year history was, that exact moment, being copied onto a secure drive 2 floors above their heads. The atrium at Halsted Logistics Group had high ceilings and a raised platform at the north end, built for exactly this kind of gathering. By 10 to 4 it was full, Erin stood in a side corridor off the platform, watching the crowd through a gap in the partition. Josie's folded drawing still in the folder under her arm, because there hadn't been a single moment all day to put it down. She could see Kessler near the center of the room, standing with the easy posture of someone expecting good news. Grant beside her, Sylvia a few feet back, arms crossed watching the stage. Further back, near a support column, she found Teresa, and beside her Reggie, two faces in a crowd of 400 that she had come, without ever meaning to actually know. Walter walked out at 4 o'clock sharp, unhurried, 40 years of doing exactly this kind of thing in his shoulders. The room settled before he'd said a word. He thanked the company for its work. He said building Halsted Logistics had been the defining project of his life, and that handing it to the right person was the most important decision he had left to make. He said he'd spent a long time thinking about what this company actually needed, not someone who understood the balance sheet, but someone who understood what it meant to work here at every level, under every condition, on the floors where nobody thinks to look, because nobody with a title ever has a reason to. The next person to run this company, Walter said, has been inside this building for the last 5 weeks, not in an office, on a floor. I asked her to come up. Erin walked onto the platform. She wore the same clothes she'd been fired in that morning, the plain trousers, the blazer that had seen 4 years of turnaround contracts, nothing borrowed for the occasion. She carried the folder. She stood beside her father and looked out at 400 faces processing something that fit no category they'd walked in with. From the distance of the platform, she watched Paige Kessler's expression move through several things in under 2 seconds. Recognition first, then calculation, then something that didn't have a clean name. Somewhere out in the crowd, she heard her own name said out loud. Not Halsted, just Erin, said the specific way you say the name of someone you sat 2 rows from for 5 weeks without ever quite seeing. Erin felt nothing reactive, watching Kessler's face do what it did. She hadn't come up here to enjoy this. She'd come up here to start the part of the day that actually mattered. She didn't deliver a speech. She gave her name, briefly, and the reason she'd asked to start on an ordinary floor instead of an office. She said it had been the most instructive 5 weeks of her professional life, and that some of what she'd learned needed attention immediately. She thanked her father, stepped aside, and asked Owen Faraday to take the floor. Owen was precise in the specific way lawyers get when they're presenting findings they're fully confident in. He said that in connection with a personnel matter earlier that day, the legal department had begun reviewing records from the 9th floor's operations team. He said the review had already uncovered evidence of a fabricated data breach used to terminate an employee without cause, and that further examination was revealing a broader pattern the company took very seriously. The review would be complete within 24 hours. All relevant personnel had been placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately. He named no one from the platform. Notifications would come directly. The atrium didn't erupt. It went still in the specific way. A room goes still when what's being said is heavy enough that people stop performing their reactions and simply absorb it. Erin stood on the platform and thought about Teresa, sitting at her desk with a controlled face, absorbing a public correction that had nothing to do with her competence. She thought about how many people on that floor had been enduring some version of this for years, watching, staying quiet, calculating exactly what it would cost to speak. She thought about the fact that not one of them had ever filed a complaint that went anywhere. That wasn't an accident. That had been the design. When the meeting broke and the atrium began to empty, she stayed on the platform a moment longer than she needed to, the folder with Josie's drawing still tucked under her arm, and understood that the hardest part of the day, the part that would actually decide what kind of leader she turned out to be, hadn't happened yet. It would happen tomorrow morning in a much smaller room, with the full audit finally laid out in front of her, and a decision to make about exactly how far the reckoning was going to reach. Erin was at a desk on the 32nd floor by 6 the next morning. The city outside was still grey, the light not yet strong enough to draw the skyline into anything. Owen arrived at 6:15 with the completed audit in a bound folder and a second copy on a secure drive. They worked through it together for 2 hours. Owen walking each section, Erin reading and asking questions. The picture was worse than what she'd seen with her own eyes. 4 years of records showed that Kessler's team had suppressed the advancement of at least 9 employees through manipulated evaluation scores. 3 of those employees had raised informal complaints through internal channels. All 3 complaints had been routed, whether by design or by a reporting structure too broken to do anything else, straight back down to Kessler's level, where they'd been logged as resolved without any real investigation behind them. One employee had left the company within 2 weeks of raising a concern, after a sudden, poorly substantiated negative review appeared in her file. Another had been quietly moved to a different floor. A third had accepted a confidential settlement and never been contacted since. One of the 9, in the file, was a data analyst named Marcus Webb who'd raised a concern about workload distribution in his 2nd year and was managing a warehouse dock in Aurora within 4 months, a demotion dressed up in the paperwork as a lateral move. Erin wrote his name on a separate sheet by hand and set it apart from the rest. She intended to call him herself. Carol Ness's name appeared in 2 of the 3 complaint files as the HR point of contact, a detail Erin noted without comment and set aside. The credit theft, meanwhile, had been systematic for years, not weeks. Grant's name showed up in favorable project summaries at a rate that bore no real relationship to what he'd actually done. Sylvie had served, in effect, as the paperwork mechanism of the whole scheme, routing the misattribution in ways that made it almost impossible to trace, without exactly the kind of close review nobody had ever run. Kessler sat above all of it, approving, authorizing, occasionally directing outright. Her fingerprints weren't always visible on the surface. They were in the structure. Erin closed the folder and looked at the window for a while. "What's the exposure if we don't act decisively?" she asked. "Significant, growing. The employee who settled is a liability that reopens the second it becomes known. We had evidence of a systemic pattern and chose to manage it quietly instead. That's not the direction I'm considering. I didn't think it was. The scope was the real question. Firing Kessler, Grant and Sylvie was straightforward. The documentation against each of them was specific. But the audit had flagged 4 other members of the team at varying levels of involvement, some active, some through a silence that had protected the scheme more than it had resisted it. Erin had read each of their files the night before, at this same desk, past midnight, and 2 of the 4 had themselves been targets of Kessler's team in earlier years, before it had apparently become easier to align with the structure than to keep resisting it. That history didn't excuse anything. It did complicate what accountability was supposed to look like inside an environment built to make integrity expensive. Carol Ness took longer to decide. Whether she'd actively buried those complaints or simply failed to escalate them was a distinction the audit could document but not fully resolve on its own. "She stays," Erin said finally, "under a formal review, not a free pass. A real one, with a real outcome attached. Acting on incomplete evidence in either direction sets the wrong precedent for how decisions get made under me." Owen made a note and didn't argue. By 9, the terminations covered Kessler, Grant, Sylvie, and the 2 other team members whose active participation the audit had clearly documented. Not the 2 who'd once been targets themselves, whose files would go to the same formal review as Carol Ness. Each notice would name the specific conduct behind it, not a generic separation line. The 2 former employees who'd left after complaining would be contacted directly within the week and made whole. So would the one who'd taken the settlement. Erin told Owen she wanted that handled with care, not speed. The goal was to make it right, not to close the file fast. And because the fraud reached past the company's own walls, touching a shell carrier and the real haulers it had quietly displaced, Owen's office would also be referring the North Line pattern to the federal agency that oversees carrier fraud in the freight industry. That part wasn't optional. Other companies, other drivers had almost certainly been paying for this too. She rode down to the 9th floor a little after 9, unannounced. The desks belonging to Kessler, Grant and Sylvie sat empty and would stay that way. The rest of the floor was there but not really working, waiting. Erin walked to the center of the room and asked if everyone could gather. It took less than a minute. She didn't stand behind anything, no podium, no desk between them. She told them the audit was complete, the decisions were made, and they were final. She wasn't there to ask for their approval. She was there because people in that room had worked inside something for years that had hurt some of them, and she thought they deserved to hear it from her directly instead of through a memo. She told them the evaluation system on that floor was suspended immediately, that every performance record from the last 4 years would go through an independent review before it was used for anything, and that a direct reporting line, one that bypassed management entirely, would be open within the week. Any questions, she said. The room stayed quiet for a moment, then Teresa Aldrich raised her hand. Will the review touch decisions that already got made? Promotions people didn't get? Yes, Erin said. That's exactly what it's for. Teresa nodded and lowered her hand. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, just a small release of something that had been held carefully in place for a long time. Erin noticed it. She didn't comment on it. Reggie Coyne raised his hand next. What about people who stayed quiet? Does that count against them too? No, Erin said. The review is about documented participation, not silence. I understand that staying quiet in that environment wasn't really a choice, it was survival. I'm not interested in punishing people for calculating what it would have cost them to speak, when the system never gave them a safe way to do it. I'm interested in making sure that calculation never has to happen again. Reggie nodded slowly and lowered his hand. A few people around him visibly exhaled. One more hand went up near the back. A data analyst named Priya Chandran, a little over a year on the floor, who had said maybe 10 words to Erin the entire time she'd sat 2 rows over. This is going to sound small, she said, but is it okay if we just say thank you? Or is that weird, given everything? Erin felt something land in her chest that she hadn't expected that morning. It's not weird, she said. Thank you for saying it out loud. Kessler called the legal line that afternoon and asked for Erin directly. Owen relayed it and asked how she wanted to handle it. Put her through. The call lasted 11 minutes. Kessler didn't open with an apology. She opened with context, the pressure from above, the competitive culture she'd inherited when she took the role, the way this floor had always run before she ever got here. She said the board had all but promised her the VP seat 18 months ago if she kept the floor's numbers clean, and that nobody upstairs had ever once asked her to define what clean meant, and that she'd made a long series of small decisions that had cumulatively carried her somewhere she'd never have agreed to go if you'd shown it to her all at once, on day one. Erin listened without interrupting. When Kessler finished, Erin said she'd read the full audit, including the years that predated anything recent, and that what it documented wasn't a product of outside pressure. It was a choice, sustained for 4 years, that had cost real people their careers, and in some cases a great deal more than that. The decision wasn't changing. I gave this company 9 years, Kessler said. I know. The severance terms are consistent with your contract and the company's obligations. Thank you for the call. She ended it there. Grant didn't call at all. A message came through his personal attorney instead, requesting reconsideration on the grounds that his role had been administrative rather than directive. Owen's office responded in writing, with the relevant pages of the audit attached, and didn't hear back. Kessler's severance ran its course over the following 6 months, same as her contract said it would. She didn't call again. The federal referral moved slower than anything else about that week. These things always do. But within a year, investigators had substantiated enough of the Northline pattern that 2 other freight companies, working entirely independently, went back through their own books and found something close to identical, sitting quietly in their own history. Grant surfaced at a competitor 11 months later. The competitor called Halsted's HR department first as a courtesy, and got a short, honest answer back. He didn't get the job. Teresa's restored promotion went through on a Thursday quietly. The way most fair decisions never seem to make it into anyone's story but the person who lived them. Erin didn't hand it to her personally. She had a new HR lead do it, with a clean explanation and no mention of everything underneath it. Teresa didn't need to know all of it. She just needed the job she'd already earned 2 years earlier, back where it belonged. The 2 employees who'd left after complaining were contacted within the week, exactly as promised. One came back to a different role, better than the one she'd lost. One didn't want to come back at all and took the settlement Owen's office offered instead, and Erin didn't argue with that either, because some doors don't need to be reopened to be made right. The custody piece resolved faster than Erin expected and with far less drama than everything else. Owen's office sent a formal letter to both family court attorneys the same week, plain, factual, notarized, confirming that Erin's termination had been the result of fabricated evidence, had been fully investigated and retracted, and that Erin Marsh had in fact been reinstated in a senior capacity at Halsted Logistics Group effective immediately. Tom's attorney withdrew the emergency motion 2 days later without much comment. There was nothing left in it to argue. Erin read that email standing in her new office with the door closed and cried for exactly 90 seconds, and then went and picked up her daughter, because 90 seconds was all the day had room for. That weekend, Josie asked why Erin had been so tired all month, in the flat, unbothered tone 7-year-olds reserve for questions that would flatten an adult twice her size. Erin thought about how to answer it for longer than the question probably deserved. Some people at my work were being unfair to people who couldn't really say anything back, she said finally, so I had to help fix it. It took a lot of days, and it was kind of scary sometimes, but it worked out. Like you're a superhero. Not really. I just had a job that let me help, and I used it. Josie considered this with the total seriousness of someone deciding whether a fact was going in the permanent record. Okay, she said. Can we get pancakes now? We can get pancakes now. It was, Erin thought, driving to the diner 2 blocks over with her daughter, singing something off a cartoon in the back seat, exactly the amount of explanation a 7-year-old needed, and exactly the amount of credit she was willing to take for any of it. Walter came by on a Friday afternoon, not for any scheduled reason. He walked the building with her for close to an hour, floor by floor, asking questions, mostly just listening to the answers. They ended up by the window on the 32nd floor, looking out at the city going gold in the late light. I spent 40 years building this, Walter said, and I spent the last few scared it was coming apart in ways I couldn't see anymore from up here. I understand that now. I never doubted you'd handle it right. I wasn't sure I would. He was quiet for a moment. That's exactly the right instinct to keep. It's the same one I had at your age. I just stopped trusting it once the company got big enough that looking down stopped being comfortable. He looked at her sideways. Don't let it get that big on you, she said she wouldn't. She meant it as much as anyone can mean a promise about who they'll still be in 20 years. The cardboard box had been sitting in the back seat of her car since the day she'd carried it out. She hadn't thought to bring it up until that evening, after the building had mostly emptied and the only light left on 32 was the one over her own desk. She went down to the garage and got it and carried it back up and set it on the corner of the desk that was officially now hers. She took out the mug and set it on the windowsill. She plugged in the charger. She opened the folder and took out Josie's drawing, a woman standing next to a very tall building folded and unfolded so many times in the last 2 weeks that the crease had gone soft, and taped it to the window right at eye level, where she'd see it every single morning from now on. None of it was worth much, but there was something worth keeping in having it visible anyway. A leader doesn't get remembered for the moment the power shows up. She gets remembered for what she does with it, who she protects, who she makes whole. What kind of floor she leaves behind for the people who'll still be standing on it long after the termination notices have faded out of anyone's memory but their own. She understood that now, in a way she hadn't the morning she'd walked into that building in plain trousers and asked for a desk on the 9th floor. The work had only just started. It had started honestly, and that was the only foundation that had ever held anything worth having. She picked Josie up from school at 3:00 Eve, same as always, parked in the same spot, same line of minivans, and one very committed dad on a cargo bike. Josie climbed in with her backpack half-zipped and a new drawing already flapping loose in one hand. "Is that your work mummy voice you're going to use tonight?" Josie asked, apropos of absolutely nothing. "Or your regular voice?" "Regular voice tonight, baby. I promise." "Good. 'Cause I need help with a fort." Erin pulled out of the school lot into ordinary traffic, ordinary light, an ordinary Tuesday that had no idea what the last 2 weeks had actually cost to get here, and found that she didn't mind that at all. Some days were allowed to just be a fort and a regular voice and a 7-year-old singing along, badly, off-key, to whatever was on the radio. She turned it up, okay. Before you scroll, let me be straight with you about what this story is and what it isn't. This is fiction. Erin isn't real. Paige Kessler isn't real. Halsted Logistics Group isn't real. Nobody got fired on a Monday and reinstated by Friday in real life, at least not that cleanly. Real HR investigations take longer than a week. Real audits take longer than a night. I compressed all of it because that's what a story does. It takes something true and speeds up the clock so you can feel the shape of it in 12 minutes instead of 4 years. Few things in here that are real though, and I put them in on purpose. Double brokering is a real and growing problem in the freight industry. It's exactly what it sounds like in the story. Someone with access reroutes a legitimate load through a fake or shell carrier, collects money that was never theirs to collect, and a real trucking company either doesn't get paid or never finds out the load existed at all. It costs small carriers real money every year, and it's part of why the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has been tightening identity verification rules industry-wide. If you work in logistics or know someone who does, it's worth knowing the term even if you never see it up close. There's a second real thing tucked into this story, quieter, and it shows up almost everywhere, even though nobody names it out loud until now. What happens when a team quietly agrees that credit for good work and blame for bad work don't have to land on the same person? It's an old trick and it isn't unique to any one industry or job title. If you've ever noticed a pattern where your work disappears from the emails that matter and your name reappears on the ones that don't, write things down, dates, screenshots, who said what to. Not because you're paranoid, because a pattern is nearly invisible to the person living inside it 1 week at a time and painfully obvious to anyone who finally sees 4 years of it laid out side by side. The other real thing in here is quieter still, and honestly the one I care about most. A lot of working parents, a lot of single parents especially, learn to hide the fact that they're stretched thin because they've watched what happens to the people who don't hide it. A sudden job loss, a messy schedule, a temp assignment under a different name. None of that means someone is unstable. Sometimes it means the opposite. Sometimes it means someone is holding 2 or 3 things together with both hands and doing it well enough that you never notice the effort underneath it. If you're in a custody situation and worried that an employer's decision could be used against you unfairly, that's a conversation worth having with a family law attorney early, not after the filing lands. You don't have to carry that calculation alone the way Erin did for 5 weeks. One more thing about Kessler, since she's the one you probably want to see get what's coming to her the most. I don't think people like her wake up deciding to become the villain of somebody else's story. I think a lot of them get shaped by a workplace that taught them cruelty was just what competence looked like once you got high enough, and they made a bad trade a long time ago, and then spent years telling themselves it was the only trade available. That doesn't make what she did to Teresa, or to Erin, or to everyone whose name is quietly missing from a project summary, anything other than wrong. It's just worth remembering that most real damage doesn't come from cartoon villains. It comes from ordinary people who decided, one small choice at a time, that someone else's dignity was an acceptable price for their own advancement. If you've ever been the person who absorbed a public correction and went very still and said, "Yes, I'll fix it," in a voice with no weather in it, I see you too. That stillness isn't weakness, it's math. You were surviving something and you did. Thanks for sticking around this far. Tell me in the comments if any part of this hit close. The floor politics, the custody fight, the box on the desk. I read all of it. Take care of each other out there. The floor you're standing on matters more than the title on the door.